What happens when someone simply vanishes? No struggle, no witness, no trace, just a name, whispered once, then lost to time. That's what happened to Matilda Hacker. In the summer of 1886, she walked through the busy streets of Philadelphia and was never seen again. No body was ever found. No one was ever charged. And yet, more than a century later, her disappearance still sends a quiet chill through history. Who was Matilda? A young woman with dreams, caught between love, trust, and betrayal. A daughter, a friend, and perhaps a victim of something far more sinister than anyone dared admit. Because behind every unsolved mystery lies something someone wanted buried. And in Matilda's case, that silence feels deliberate, the kind that hides guilt, not grief. Why did no one look for her? Why did her story fade so quickly? And who, even now, wants it forgotten? Tonight, we'll reopen a case that time tried to erase. A case where every clue leads to another question, and every answer feels just a little too late. This is the forgotten story of Matilda Hacker, a mystery that never truly disappeared. Before her name was splashed across newspapers and whispered in royal corridors, Martha Raey was just a girl from humble beginnings. Born in 1742, likely in London, Martha didn't come from nobility or money. Her early life is sparsely documented, typical for women of her class at the time, but we know enough to understand that she came from a modest background and that her beauty and intelligence would ultimately shape the course of her life. For better and for worse, she was described by those who knew her as elegant, composed, and intelligent, a woman with a natural air of refinement, even though she had no formal education to speak of. In a society rigidly structured by class and birthright, Martha's grace and charm made her stand out. She wasn't born into influence, but she attracted it. By her late teens, Martha had caught the attention of John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, a powerful political figure, naval administrator, and one of the most controversial members of the British aristocracy. He was nearly twice her age, married, and deeply entrenched in the upper echelons of government. But despite the scandal such a pairing might provoke, Martha became his mistress. And not just in passing, this was a relationship that would define her adult life. They lived together, in effect, as man and wife. Martha bore the Earl 9 children, many of whom were quietly acknowledged and even provided for by Montague. Their relationship spanned more than 15 years, a remarkable length of time for what society then would have deemed an illicit arrangement. It was not simply an affair. It was a domestic life, albeit one constrained by secrecy, social politics, and imbalance. And yet, it wasn't just a life of shadows. Martha had access to the privileges that came with proximity to power. She lived in respectable homes, had servants, attended functions, and enjoyed many of the cultural riches London had to offer. Music, especially opera, was a known passion of hers, a detail that would later take on a tragic irony. Despite this position, Martha remained in a precarious place. She was not legally married. She held no title. She had no true protections under law. Everything she had, her home, her reputation, her status, depended on Montague's favor. And in the strict moral lens of 18th century England, a woman like Martha could be elevated or destroyed on a whim. To some, she was a kept woman. To others, a mother, a lover, a fixture in high society, but never truly accepted. As time passed, Montague grew increasingly absorbed in politics and public duties, especially as tensions rose across the Atlantic with the American colonies. Their relationship, while still ongoing, became less intimate and more distant. Martha, now in her mid-30s, began to feel that distance deeply. And it's around this time that James Hackman entered her life. Hackman was a former army officer, now a clergyman, and significantly younger than both Martha and the Earl. He became infatuated with Martha, whether out of Genuine love or obsessive desire is still debated. She reportedly entertained a brief connection with him, possibly during one of Montague's long absences. Some historians suggest she was considering a more legitimate, secure future for herself and her children. Others believe she tried to end things with Hackman, only to find he couldn't accept rejection, regardless of what truly passed between them. This relationship would prove fatal. Martha Raey was, in many ways, a woman caught between worlds, between respectability and scandal, visibility and vulnerability. Her life, though filled with comfort and privilege on the surface, was shaped by quiet compromises. Her every move was watched, judged, whispered about. She didn't belong to any one class, not noble, not common, but suspended somewhere in between. She wasn't just a victim of violence. She was a woman shaped by her era, by her limitations, and by the men who dictated the terms of her life. And when those terms shifted, when she tried to redefine herself, the result was something no one could have predicted. What happened next would play out not in secret, but in the most public and horrifying way imaginable. A murder not in darkness, but in the full light of London's high society. It was a spring evening in April of 1779, the kind of mild, breezy night that invited people into the streets of Covent Garden. For Londoners of all ranks, the Royal Opera House was more than just a theater. It was a place where the social elite mingled with aspiring artists, where whispers carried more weight than applause, and where appearances could be everything. On this particular night, the music would begin, as always, around 8 p.m. But by the end of the performance, the entire city would be shaken by a public murder that no one saw coming. Martha Raey, accompanied by a friend, was attending the opera, something she did frequently. She was reportedly dressed modestly, but with grace, always aware of how closely society watched her. For someone like Martha, every outing was a performance in its own right. She was known to love music, and the opera was one of the few places where she could simply blend in an anonymous face in a candlelit crowd. But she wouldn't remain anonymous for long. Earlier that day, James Hackman, the young clergyman who had once courted Martha, was reportedly seen pacing near Piccadilly, appearing agitated. Witnesses later described him as nervous, distracted, not himself. Some would say he had been drinking. Others said he was simply distressed. What we do know is that Hackman had learned Martha would be attending the opera that evening, and it's believed that when he confirmed this, something in him broke. By 7 p.m., Hackman had armed himself with 2 pistols. Why 2? Perhaps he intended one for her, and one for himself. Or perhaps he wasn't sure he'd go through with it at all. Either way, he arrived at Covent Garden before the performance began, lingering outside the venue. Observers noted he stayed close to the entrance, but didn't purchase a ticket. He wasn't there for the opera. As the music played inside, Martha sat unaware of the storm gathering outside the gilded walls. There's no indication she saw Hackman that night until the very end. And by then, it was far too late. Around 10 p.m., as the audience began to trickle out into the night air, Martha and her companion exited through the main doors. Gas lamps flickered along Bow Street. Hackman was waiting. As Martha stepped into the open, he approached from behind. Without warning, he drew a pistol and shot her in the head at close range. Panic erupted instantly. Screams filled the street. Martha collapsed onto the cobblestones as blood pooled beneath her. But Hackman wasn't finished. In a frenzied motion, he pulled out the second pistol and fired at himself, intending to end his own life. The shot struck him, but not fatally. He fell beside her, bleeding but alive. Bystanders rushed to the scene. One man, an off-duty constable, held Hackman down as others called for help. Martha, however, was beyond saving. She died almost instantly. What made this act so horrifying wasn't just the brutality, it was the setting. A woman of status, killed in front of London's cultural elite, outside one of the most visible landmarks in the city. And her killer wasn't a stranger from the shadows. It was a man she had known. A man she may have once trusted. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Hackman, still bleeding, was arrested on the spot. When questioned, he reportedly said only, "Forgive me. I loved her beyond expression." Whether it was guilt, delusion, or something more unhinged, no one could say. But even in that moment, people began asking questions. Why had she gone to the opera that night? Had she known Hackman might be there? Had she feared him? Or had she simply tried to live her life, unaware that someone she had rejected was now unraveling? One of the strangest details came from an unnamed witness, a man standing near the opera house entrance, who claimed he saw Hackman rehearsing the moment hours earlier. He stood by the pillar, the man said later, his hand in his coat as if drawing something. I thought little of it, but now it chills me. The following morning, London's newspapers exploded. Headlines told of the assassination at the opera, of murder in the street, and of a clergyman turned killer. But beneath the spectacle, a darker truth remained. Martha Raey was dead, murdered not for wealth, not for power, but because she had rejected someone who couldn't let go. There's a strange, unsettling silence in this part of her story. No final words. No chase. Just a quiet, unassuming exit from a night of music. And the sudden, irreversible end of a woman whose life had already been shaped by other people's decisions. It all happened in a matter of seconds, but the ripple effects would stretch across decades. And the questions about motive, about intent, about justice would never quite go away, because this wasn't just a crime of passion. For some, it was a symptom of something deeper, a society that gave men power over women's lives and left women like Martha with no true protection when that power turned deadly. The investigation into the murder of Martha Raey began the moment her body hit the pavement. With James Hackman wounded, weapon in hand, and surrounded by witnesses, the case seemed all but open and shut. And in many ways, it was at least in the eyes of the law. But what unfolded in the hours and days that followed revealed far more than just guilt or innocence. It exposed how class, gender, and perception shaped justice in 18th century Britain. Immediately after the shooting outside Covent Garden, Hackman was taken into custody. Despite his self-inflicted wound, he was deemed well enough to be interrogated. He offered no resistance, reportedly saying he had lost his senses and that he had been led by passion and despair. These statements, coupled with the presence of 2 pistols and several eyewitnesses, left little ambiguity regarding who had pulled the trigger. The Bow Street Runners London's early form of organized police responded quickly, but their investigative resources were limited. There was no crime scene tape, no forensic team, and certainly no modern ballistics or psychological profiling. Instead, the investigation focused on witness testimonies and public perception, which proved both illuminating and problematic. Witnesses outside the opera house offered consistent, though sometimes sensationalized, accounts. Several claimed to have seen Hackman stalking Martha from a distance, while others described his movements as calculated and strangely calm before the attack. One man even claimed he saw Hackman loading a pistol hours earlier near Charing Cross, though this account was never verified. Inside Martha's social circle, reactions were mixed. Some of her acquaintances described her relationship with Hackman as brief and polite, suggesting she had ended things cleanly months before the murder. Others implied she had continued to correspond with him, perhaps stringing him along unintentionally. Hackman's friends, meanwhile, painted a picture of a man deeply infatuated, emotionally fragile, and increasingly unstable in the weeks before the crime. But there were no other suspects. No red herrings. No mystery about who fired the shot. The real debate became one of motivation and mental state. Was Hackman a cold-blooded killer, or a man broken by unrequited love? And was Martha simply a tragic victim? Or, according to some sensationalist papers, a woman who had tempted fate by living outside the bounds of proper society? This question of morality quickly took over public discourse. In many newspapers, especially the more conservative publications, the murder was framed not just as a crime of passion, but as a moral consequence of Martha's lifestyle. The fact that she was a mistress, however long-standing and loyal, was used to subtly imply that she had invited scandal into her life. It was a cruel and deeply unfair assessment, but one that resonated with a public eager to make sense of the horror. Meanwhile, Hackman's status as a clergyman and former soldier complicated things further. He wasn't just any man, he was educated, respected, and connected. His fall from grace added a layer of tragedy that many found compelling, even sympathetic. As a result, his trial became as much about social decay as it was about personal responsibility. When the case went to court, it moved swiftly. Hackman was tried at the Old Bailey, where the evidence against him was undeniable. The pistols were produced, the witnesses testified, and his own admission sealed the case. Yet the courtroom was packed not just with legal observers, but with members of the public, nobility, and gossip-mongers alike. The trial was spectacle, a drama in its own right. Hackman's defense rested on the claim of temporary insanity, a relatively new concept in the legal world at the time. His barrister argued that he had been driven to a moment of madness by romantic despair. But the judge and the jury saw through it. The verdict was swift. Guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death and hanged at Tyburn within days, a common practice at the time. Thousands gathered to watch the execution. Some reportedly wept. Others cheered. Hackman, for his part, showed remorse, offering prayers and accepting his fate quietly. But for all the speed and certainty of his conviction, the case left behind a tangle of lingering questions. Why had no one intervened earlier when Hackman's obsession became apparent? Why had Martha been left unprotected, despite the apparent danger? Was her death truly an isolated act of passion, or the inevitable result of a society that permitted women like her to be both visible and vulnerable, yet never truly safe? There were no forensic limitations per se, because there was no forensic science as we know it today. No autopsy results were made public. No gunpowder residue was tested. Everything hinged on what people saw, what they believed, and how they interpreted those beliefs through the lens of morality. In the days following the murder, artists painted scenes of Martha's final moments. Pamphlets were sold on the street with dramatized versions of the tragedy. Poets wrote verses. Even as she was buried, her story was being rewritten by others, romanticized, judged, mourned, and manipulated. And just like that, the official investigation ended. Hackman was dead. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. But many still questioned whether it had been justice at all, or simply retribution masked as order, because in the end, the questions that matter most were never answered. Who failed to protect Martha? Why was her life so easily reduced to a headline? And what does it say about a society that allowed her to be remembered not for who she was, but for how she died? When a murder is committed in full view of the public right outside a prestigious opera house, no less you might think the motive is clear, the conclusion easy. And for many at the time, that's exactly what it seemed. The most commonly accepted theory about the murder of Martha Raey was straightforward and tragic. James Hackman was a man consumed by love, spiraling into jealousy and despair, who ultimately committed murder because he couldn't bear to live without her. To the public, it was a textbook case of emotional obsession. Hackman, a former Army officer who had taken holy orders and become a clergyman, was widely known to have developed an intense affection for Martha. According to some accounts, their connection began while Hackman was still a military man, and though it's unclear exactly how deep their relationship went, What is certain is this: he proposed marriage, and she declined. Rejection may have broken something in him from that point onward. His letters grew more passionate, his demeanor increasingly unstable. Friends began to notice changes. One even advised him to leave London and forget her, but Hackman couldn't or wouldn't let go. Many believe his motive was heartbreak, layered with humiliation. After all, Martha wasn't just any woman. She was the long-term mistress of a powerful nobleman, the Earl of Sandwich. She lived in relative comfort, bore the Earl children, and moved in a social circle that Hackman, as a clergyman with modest prospects, couldn't penetrate. When Martha rejected him, it wasn't just emotional loss, it was social exclusion. To be refused by a woman who was already spoken for by someone vastly more powerful may have felt like a personal and public failure. And then came April 7th, 1779, the night of the opera. According to this theory, Hackman had discovered that Martha would be attending a performance at Covent Garden's Royal Opera House. He followed her there, carrying 2 flintlock pistols. Some say one was meant for her, the other for himself, a murder-suicide fueled by obsessive desperation. He waited outside while the opera played, and when she exited the building with a friend, he shot her in the head at close range, then turned the second pistol on himself. He survived. She did not. The means are evident. The opportunity was carefully chosen. The motive, to many, was heartbreak. It's a narrative that made sense to the authorities, to the press, and to a society that had long blurred the lines between romantic passion and possessive control. But there's something about this version of events that doesn't quite sit right. For starters, Hackman's behavior that evening showed signs of planning, not impulsive madness. He didn't try to confront her earlier in the day. He didn't make a final plea or send a letter. He waited until she was in a public space, then struck with sudden violence. That's not just the action of a broken-hearted man. It suggests a degree of intent that makes the crime of passion theory feel too neat. Then there's the issue of the second pistol. Many assumed it was meant for suicide, but historians have noted that flintlock pistols were notoriously unreliable. Was the second weapon actually a backup in case the first misfired? If so, that implies calculation, not despair. Additionally, Hackman's claim of being overtaken by uncontrollable emotion, what some would now call a temporary insanity defense, was viewed skeptically even then. The judge in his trial remarked that the murder was cold and deliberate, not a spontaneous act. And yet, public sympathy flowed not for Martha, but for Hackman. Poets and commentators romanticized his torment, describing him as a victim of unreturned love. Martha, on the other hand, was often vilified, subtly or explicitly, for being a mistress, for living a life that defied conventional respectability. Her death was framed by some as inevitable, almost expected. This cultural bias may have influenced not only how her murder was interpreted, but how her life was remembered. It's also worth questioning. What was Hackman really hoping to achieve? If he wanted to possess Martha, he had lost her. If he wanted to punish her, he succeeded. But if he truly loved her, why murder her? There's a chasm between heartbreak and homicide, and the ease with which 18th century society accepted that leap says more about the times than it does about Hackman himself. So yes, many believe the obvious answer is the true one, that James Hackman, overwhelmed by rejection and love unreturned, chose violence as his final expression. But even now, over 2 centuries later, that explanation feels incomplete, because when you peel back the layers, when you look beyond the courtroom transcripts and flowery poems, this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a public execution planned, performed, and witnessed, and perhaps the most unsettling part of all is how quickly the world moved on. The official narrative that Martha Raey was murdered by a jilted lover, unable to control his emotions, has persisted for centuries. But there is another line of thought, far less discussed, that paints her death in a far more troubling light. One that suggests this may not have been a simple crime of passion, but rather a killing that silenced a woman who had become too inconvenient. Could it be possible that James Hackman wasn't acting alone, at least not in terms of motivation? Could there have been pressure, manipulation, or even encouragement from someone with far more power than he ever had? To explore this, we must consider Martha's unique position in society. She was not merely a socialite or a mistress. She was the long-term partner of John Montagu, the fourth Earl of Sandwich, a powerful and controversial figure in 18th century British politics. Montagu held immense political influence. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty and had deep ties to both the monarchy and Parliament. Their relationship, while never formalized through marriage, had produced several children. She was, in many ways, a liability in a world where image was everything. At the time of her murder, Montagu's political reputation was already embattled. He was ridiculed in the press, satirized by his enemies, and increasingly viewed as out of touch. And here was Martha, his mistress of many years, still publicly visible, still connected to him, still potentially capable of bringing scandal to his name. Some historians have quietly speculated that Martha had begun pressing Montagu for greater recognition, or even financial security for her children. If true, that would have complicated his already fragile standing. One cannot help but wonder, was Martha becoming too much of a political risk? Now enter James Hackman. He was a relatively unknown clergyman with ties to the military and possibly socially vulnerable. His romantic interest in Martha gave him proximity. But what if someone saw in him a perfect vessel for a crime? Someone whose obsession could be fueled, whose instability could be exploited, and who, once he pulled the trigger, could conveniently take the fall without raising further questions. There is, of course, no concrete evidence to support this theory. No letters, no confessions, no recorded meetings in shadowy alleyways. But there are subtle signs, a quick trial, a faster execution, and a press more interested in condemning Martha's morality than questioning the circumstances of her death. Could that haste have been designed to bury something deeper? Some theorists also point to the fact that Hackman never implicated anyone else, even when he had the opportunity to speak freely before his execution. But that silence could suggest many things: shame, fear, or even a promise made under pressure. If he had been manipulated into believing the act would restore his dignity, perhaps even win Martha back in death, it's not hard to imagine how that might have warped his sense of justice. And then there's the issue of the two pistols. We often assume one was meant for him and one for her. But some have suggested that Hackman may have expected a confrontation, that perhaps someone warned him Martha would be with another man that night, and that his reaction would seem more justified in the eyes of the public. If so, he might have brought two weapons not out of despair, but out of fear or preparation. The unsettling truth is that Martha Raey lived in a world where her choices were scrutinized, but her safety was never guaranteed. She existed in the liminal space between public fascination and private abandonment. Her life, though privileged in appearance, was not protected. And her death, while shocking, became a vehicle for moralistic storytelling more than it did for justice. It's hard not to wonder, did the system work exactly as it was meant to? Was Hackman the sole villain, or merely the most convenient one? These questions have no easy answers. And it's entirely possible that Hackman acted alone, driven by personal heartbreak and mental decline. But it's also possible quietly, disturbingly possible, that someone else benefited from Martha Raey's silence. Someone who needed her gone. Someone who ensured that Hackman would be remembered as the tragic figure, while Martha's life would be reduced to a cautionary tale. The unsettling theory lingers because it reminds us that sometimes the cleanest stories are the ones most carefully constructed, and Martha's murder was wrapped in scandal from the very beginning. There's something profoundly unsettling about how quickly Martha Raey's story faded from public view. In the days after her death, her name was on every Londoner's lips, printed in the newspapers, whispered in drawing rooms, debated in the alleys outside the theater. But as swiftly as the headlines came, they disappeared. And with them, any deeper investigation into the circumstances surrounding her murder. James Hackman was executed just 9 days after the crime, a timeline that by today's standards feels inconceivably fast. There was no inquest, no call for deeper inquiry. No efforts were made to explore what led him to the Opera House that night, or what might have been happening behind the scenes. Once he swung from the gallows at Tyburn, the case was considered closed. And for most people, it was. But for those who knew Martha, truly knew her, the questions never stopped. How had it come to this? Could anything have been done to protect her? Was there more to Hackman's motive than heartbreak? And why had the press, and even the court, focused more on Martha's reputation than her murder? These weren't idle musings. They were the questions whispered in hushed tones by her friends, her family, and others who had watched her navigate a life filled with social contradiction. A woman beloved by one of the most powerful men in Britain, yet never fully protected. A mother to his children, yet never granted the title of wife. A social figure, yet always at the margins. In the years that followed, no further investigation was ever opened. No new evidence was uncovered. No anonymous letters appeared. No confessions surfaced. No witnesses came forward claiming to know more than they had said in court. For all intents and purposes, the trail went cold before it ever had a chance to warm up. What remains today are fragments, pamphlets, and poetry, trial records, and portraits, each offering a version of Martha Raey, but none of them entirely whole. Her death has been retold as tragedy, romanticized in plays and literature, and used as a cautionary tale for women who dared to live outside societal norms. But the real woman, the one behind the scandal, was quietly lost. The emotional toll on her family was rarely discussed. Her children, some fathered by Montague, were left in an awkward limbo. Though Montague continued to support them financially, he never spoke publicly about Martha's death. There was no memorial erected, no justice campaign, just silence. A silence that perhaps said more than any eulogy ever could. And over time, as newer crimes and fresher scandals took center stage, Martha's case drifted into obscurity. Not because it was solved, but because society had already decided what version of the story it wanted to believe. Even modern historians have struggled to revisit the case with any clarity. With so little forensic evidence, no physical records beyond the trial, and no first-hand letters from Martha herself, her voice remains the most absent in her own story. We hear from Hackman, from the court, from the press, but not from her. It's hard not to wonder what she might have said had she been given the chance. About her life, about Hackman, about Montague, about what it meant to live in the spaces between acceptance and judgment, love and convenience, privilege and vulnerability. Today, more than 2 centuries later, the mystery remains not just of who killed Martha Raey, but of who allowed her to be forgotten so easily. The lack of follow-up investigation, the social silence, and the reshaping of her story into something moralistic rather than human, all point to a deeper failure, one that speaks less about crime and more about complicity. And so, the trail went cold, not because the answers were too far out of reach, but because no one wanted to keep asking the questions. Thank you for joining us on this quiet, haunting investigation into the tragic case of Martha Raey, a woman lost not only to violence, but to time, her story left tangled in scandal, silence, and unanswered questions. If you've heard of this case before, or if you have thoughts about the theories we explored, we invite you to share them in the comments below. Your insights help keep these forgotten stories alive, and if you appreciate thoughtful, reflective true crime content like this, Please consider subscribing to the channel for more cases that chill, disturb, and linger long after the screen fades to black. Because sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones history tried to forget.